The night settles gently over the countryside, and with it comes a sense of quiet that feels almost timeless. Imagine the open expanse of Brazil in the 1950s, where farmlands stretched for miles beneath a sky so wide that it seemed endless. Out here, away from the cities, the silence of night was broken only by the sounds of nature. The steady hum of insects, the distant call of night birds, and the faint rustle of crops swaying under the breeze. It was the kind of stillness that encouraged reflection, the kind of setting where stories take on a life of their own, where the ordinary could slip seamlessly into the extraordinary. As you lie back and let this story carry you, allow your breathing to slow, as though you were standing in those fields, surrounded by night air that is cool, calm, and steady. In these moments, the boundary between the everyday and the mysterious becomes thinner, almost transparent. This is the atmosphere into which the story of Antonio Villas Boas first emerged, a young Brazilian farmer whose name for a time echoed in whispers among researchers of the unexplained, and whose account would eventually become one of the earliest and most detailed alien abduction stories in modern history. But we will not rush into the strange details just yet. Instead, we will take our time. For this is not just a sensational tale to be told quickly. It is a layered narrative, one that requires patience and space. By unfolding it slowly, step by step, you will have room not only to picture Antonio's world, but also to relax into its rhythm. Just as a farmer walks his fields deliberately, we too will walk carefully through this mystery. In 1957, Antonio was 23 years old, living and working in a rural part of Brazil. His world was simple in many ways: long days in the fields, long nights of labor under the stars. Yet the year in which his story takes place was not a simple one. Globally, it was a decade charged with fear, wonder, and change. The Cold War was shaping imaginations. Newspapers carried stories of satellites and nuclear tests, and whispers of visitors from the skies were spreading far beyond the borders of any one country. Against this backdrop, Antonio's experience would one day be remembered as both deeply personal and strangely universal. But for the moment, imagine yourself in his place. The sun has set, and you are still in the fields, a plow pulled behind your tractor, soil turning steadily beneath the darkening sky. Above you, stars begin to emerge, thousands of them, unclouded by the glare of city lights. The night air carries a calmness, but also an edge of mystery. On nights like these, the universe feels impossibly close, as though it is watching. It is in this silence, in this vastness, that Antonio's life would soon intersect with something he could not explain. His story would not remain only his own. It would ripple outward, reaching doctors, journalists, researchers, skeptics, and eventually historians. Yet in its first telling, it was a simple account of a man in a field, working late, when a light appeared. Before we step fully into his encounter, it is worth pausing to acknowledge what makes this case so unusual. While UFO sightings had already entered popular awareness, Antonio's account in Brazil predates even the famous American abduction story of Betty and Barney Hill by several years. It was, in many respects, the first of its kind, a complete narrative of being taken aboard a craft, examined and returned. And yet, unlike so many stories that explode into sensational headlines, Antonio's remained quiet, even obscure, for many years. His was not a tale broadcast loudly. It was one shared quietly, carefully, with details preserved in interviews and reports. As we prepare to follow this journey, remember that the aim here is not to convince or to sensationalize, but simply to walk slowly through the record. You may drift in and out of attention, as people often do when lying in bed, but the story will remain steady, waiting, like a path through the fields at night. Every step is deliberate, every detail gently laid out, so you can relax into it fully. So let the rhythm of your breathing fall in step with the rhythm of this story. In the distance, a faint red light will appear, but not yet. For now we are still standing at the edge of the field, still within the ordinary world of a young farmer's life. Soon, however, that ordinary world will open to the extraordinary, and the mystery will deepen. But as with all things at night, There is no need to rush. The sky is vast, the stars are patient, and this forgotten case of Antonio Villas Boas is ready to be remembered, one detail at a time. To understand the strange experience of Antonio Villas Boas, it is important first to settle into the world he lived in. A Brazil that in the 1950s was standing at a crossroads between tradition and modernization. The cities were growing, industries were taking shape, and modern politics and global tensions were finding their way into everyday life. But much of the country was still rural, still shaped by the rhythms of farming, by long nights under open skies, and by communities that lived closer to folklore and faith than to science and technology. Brazil in this decade was not yet the bustling, modernized nation that many picture today. In rural areas like Minas Gerais and São Francisco de Sales, where Antonio lived and worked, tractors were scarce, roads were dusty and unpaved, and electricity was often unreliable. Farmers relied heavily on their own strength, the help of family, and simple tools. Life was hard, but steady, shaped by the cycles of planting, harvest, and weather. For people in these regions, the stars at night were not obscured by neon or headlights. They were companions, constant presences that loomed quietly above the fields. But beyond these quiet farms, Brazil was also a nation touched by global forces. The Cold War had cast its long shadow over Latin America, with the United States and the Soviet Union competing for influence. In 1957, the very year Antonio's encounter would take place, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first satellite to orbit Earth. Newspapers across Brazil reported it with awe and unease. Suddenly the idea of objects flying through the sky, beyond human control, no longer felt like fantasy. People were beginning to imagine that the heavens above were not just for gods or stars, but also for machines, for spies, and perhaps even for visitors not of this world. UFO reports had already started to surface around the globe. The famous Roswell incident of 1947 in New Mexico had planted seeds of fascination and suspicion in the public imagination. Reports of strange flying discs or glowing lights in the sky became a recurring feature in newspapers, sometimes dismissed as hoaxes, sometimes whispered about with unease. Brazil was not isolated from these stories. Pilots, fishermen, and farmers alike reported seeing unusual objects, lights that darted across the horizon, shapes that hovered silently, or glowing spheres that appeared to follow travelers at night. For a people already steeped in stories of spirits, mythical beings, and heavenly signs, these sightings blended seamlessly with old traditions. Brazilian culture has always carried a strong connection to the mystical and the spiritual. From the Catholic faith that dominated daily life, to indigenous folklore and African-inspired traditions, the supernatural was never far from people's thoughts. Tales of Sacapere, trickster spirits, or of ghostly women wandering country roads at night, were shared as warnings and entertainment. In the rural imagination, the line between real and unreal was already porous. So when Antonio's strange experience was eventually told, it did not emerge into a vacuum. It entered a culture that already made room for the mysterious. At the same time, Brazil was undergoing changes that made encounters with the modern unknown more likely. Farming communities like Antonio's were beginning to adopt technology slowly. Tractors, lamps, and even radios were finding their way into rural life. Radios in particular carried stories from the outside world, news of Cold War tensions, of atomic bombs, of the space race. When farmers like Antonio tuned in, they were exposed to a mixture of wonder and dread. On one hand, it was exciting to hear about rockets leaving Earth. On the other, it was frightening to imagine what else might come down from the sky. In this atmosphere, Antonio's late-night work in the fields takes on a deeper meaning. He was a man suspended between two worlds, the old world of the farm, where nights were long and stars steady, and the modern world creeping in with satellites, political tension, and whispers of UFOs. His experience cannot be fully understood without recognizing how the world around him was already shifting toward fascination with the skies. This was also a period when governments, Brazil included, were quietly paying attention to UFO reports. The Brazilian Air Force, like others around the world, occasionally investigated sightings, often in secret. While these documents were not widely shared at the time, later researchers discovered that officials were not always as dismissive as the public believed. Military pilots had reported objects they could not explain. Naval officers spoke of glowing orbs that tracked ships. Ordinary citizens, too, often described the skies as strangely active. This cultural undercurrent helps us see Antonio's story not as a lone, isolated event, but as part of a larger landscape of curiosity, fear, and speculation. So picture Brazil in 1957, warm nights, the hum of insects, and wide stretches of farmland. Radios buzz with reports of Sputnik passing overhead, families whisper of strange lights in the sky, and in some circles, researchers debate whether Earth is being watched. Against this backdrop, one young farmer would claim to have been taken aboard a craft unlike anything known to man. Whether you view it as fact, folklore, or something in between, his story is inseparable from the Brazil of the 1950s, a place both grounded in tradition and open to mystery. In this way, the stage is set, the soil is rich, the skies vast, and the atmosphere heavy with change. A forgotten case like Antonio's could only have arisen in such a world, half bound to the earth, half gazing upward. And now, with this context, we are ready to meet him, to step into his life, before the night that would change it forever. Before we step into the extraordinary night that defined his life, it is important to pause and understand the man himself, the quiet farmer, whose story would ripple far beyond his small community. Without knowing who Antonio Villas Boas was, the encounter risks being reduced to just another strange tale. But Antonio was more than a character in a mystery. He was a young man with a family with responsibilities, and with the kind of ordinary life that makes his later account feel both shocking and deeply human. Antonio was born in 1934 in the countryside of Minas Gerais, Brazil, into a hard-working farming family. Life on a Brazilian farm in those years was not one of luxury or leisure. It was long hours in the fields, weather dictating survival, and routines built on repetition. By the time he reached his early 20s, Antonio had already settled into this rhythm. He was not a drifter, nor a dreamer lost in imagination. He was a man whose days began before sunrise, whose evenings often stretched late into the night, as he worked under the open skies. Unlike many in his rural community, Antonio had the benefit of literacy. He could read and write, and this small detail set him apart. It meant he could access newspapers, legal documents, and the occasional scientific text, tiny windows into a wider world. Yet he was not a scholar, nor someone obsessed with unusual ideas. Those who knew him described him as serious, reliable, and grounded. He was the kind of person others trusted with work and with family responsibilities. This background would later become crucial when researchers and skeptics alike asked, was he the type to invent a story so extraordinary? Antonio's family was central to his life. He worked alongside his brothers in the fields, sharing the load of farm duties. Their nights were often long, for the family had a habit of plowing the fields after dark. This was partly practical. The heat of the Brazilian sun could be punishing by day, and partly due to necessity. With limited manpower and equipment, the Villas Boas family used every available hour to tend their land. It was under these circumstances that Antonio found himself working late at night, in the silence of the fields, when his life would take a turn that no farmer could have predicted. At 23, Antonio was at the age where questions about the future quietly pressed against his present. He was unmarried, but in a rural community like his, thoughts of settling down were never far away. Responsibility weighed on him, responsibility to his family, to the farm, and to the expectations of adulthood. These details, though small, matter when looking at his later account. He was not a boy chasing fantasy, nor an elder reminiscing about myths. He was at the height of his practical, working years, with little reason to chase attention, or to fabricate a tale that could bring ridicule. Psychologists who later examined his story often asked what might have been happening in Antonio's inner life. Was he restless, longing for change, seeking something beyond the routine, Or was he simply a man whose ordinary life collided with the extraordinary? His friends and family offered few hints. By all accounts, Antonio did not speak often of dreams, desires, or imagination. His focus was on the tangible, the soil, the crops, the machinery that helped keep the farm alive. This is part of what makes his later testimony so striking. A man who seemed rooted in the ground, literally and figuratively, suddenly claimed to have been swept into the sky. Antonio's reputation in his community further complicates the story. He was not known as a liar or a joker. He was not the sort who spun tales for entertainment. Instead, he carried himself with a kind of seriousness, a certain reserve, that gave weight to his words. When he eventually told his family, and later researchers, what had happened, his story did not come across as playful or exaggerated. He recounted it with the steadiness of someone describing a memory, however strange. In preparing to hear his account, it is helpful to hold this image of Antonio in mind. Picture him, a young man, with strong hands from farming, dark hair, steady eyes, and the posture of someone accustomed to physical labor. He carried the earth beneath his nails, and the patience of fields in his breath. His world was narrow, but secure. He was not a man looking for the spotlight, and yet, history would place him among the first to claim an encounter that would one day define the very idea of alien abduction. Understanding Antonio as a person allows us to hear his testimony with greater nuance. His life was ordinary, his background steady, and his reputation respectable. This does not prove that his story was true, but it shapes the way we receive it. Extraordinary claims from extraordinary people can sometimes feel expected, but when extraordinary claims come from someone ordinary, they resonate differently. They unsettle us, because they suggest that perhaps the strange is not reserved for those who seek it. Perhaps the strange arrives uninvited, even into the life of a farmer under the stars. It is from this foundation, Antonio's grounded, practical life, that the events of October 1957 must be approached. Soon the quiet of his fields would be interrupted by a light, and his name, once unknown outside his small community, would become linked forever to one of the strangest and most debated encounters in UFO history. The night of October 16, 1957 began like so many others for Antonio Villas Boas. The fields stretched wide, the soil freshly turned, and the tractor rumbled steadily beneath the glow of the stars. Working at night was his habit, a way to escape the blistering heat of the Brazilian sun. It was a rhythm of life he knew well. Hours alone with the land, guided only by the pull of the machine, the smell of earth, and the open sky above. Nothing about that evening suggested it would be different, yet by dawn, Antonio would believe his world had been changed forever. It started with a light. At first, Antonio thought little of it. A faint red glow shimmered on the horizon, the kind of thing a tired farmer might dismiss as a star, or perhaps the light of a passing airplane. He wiped the sweat from his brow and continued working, his tractor pushing forward into the night. But the light did not fade. It grew brighter, closer, as if aware of him. Slowly, steadily, it began to descend. Antonio stopped the tractor, his eyes fixed on the strange glow. It wasn't like a plane or a star. It had a strange steadiness, a controlled movement that felt deliberate. He later described it as an oval or egg-shaped craft, supported on 3 legs, radiating a harsh red light that illuminated the darkened field. For a moment he was frozen, his body rooted to the seat of his tractor, his mind caught between disbelief and fear. The fields around him, so familiar and steady, suddenly felt alien. The craft descended until it hovered just above the ground, its red glow casting eerie shadows across the crops. The hum of the night seemed to vanish, replaced by a heavy silence. Antonio felt a pull inside him, a mixture of dread and curiosity. He tried to restart the tractor, to turn away from the presence, but the engine sputtered and died. Panic surged. He leapt from the machine, his boots hitting the earth, and began to run. Before he could escape, figures emerged, Small humanoid beings stepped out of the craft, their movements swift and coordinated. Antonio later described them as wearing tight-fitting suits, helmets with narrow slits for eyes, and carrying an otherworldly presence that made them both human-like and alien. They moved toward him with determination, their gestures commanding but wordless. Antonio struggled, fighting to free himself, but they overpowered him with surprising strength. He was dragged toward the glowing craft, his cries swallowed by the vast emptiness of the farmland. Antonio would later recall every detail with a clarity that unsettled those who heard him. He described being pulled inside, where the air was heavy and metallic, filled with a smell unlike anything he had known. The interior of the craft was strange, almost clinical. Bright lights illuminated walls, lined with instruments he could not recognize, levers and panels that seemed both advanced and unfamiliar. What followed has remained one of the most unusual and controversial aspects of his story. Antonio reported being stripped of his clothing and covered in a strange gel-like substance. He was placed on a table, examined by the beings with tools he could not identify. They pricked his skin, drew samples of his blood, and spoke to one another in a language that was sharp, unlike any human tongue he had ever heard. Their voices, he said, carried a series of barks or growls, incomprehensible but clearly communicative. Then came an encounter that has puzzled researchers for decades. A female figure entered, a being similar in form to the others, but with features Antonio described as distinctly feminine. She had long, white hair, large, slanted eyes, and pale skin. Antonio claimed that she approached him with intent, that what followed was a sexual encounter orchestrated by the beings, as though he were part of an experiment or a ritual. It was an element of his story that many found difficult to believe, and yet Antonio never wavered in recounting it. He insisted that it happened, that it was part of what he endured aboard that craft. After this bizarre episode, Antonio said the beings returned him to the main area of the ship. He was shown around briefly, as though they wanted him to see their instruments, their panels of blinking lights, and incomprehensible devices. He felt as though he were being observed, studied not only as a specimen, but as a man forced to bear witness. Eventually, the beings led him back outside. The red glow of the craft filled the night once more, as he was released onto the field. Dazed, weak, and confused, Antonio staggered back to his tractor. The craft lifted, rising silently into the night sky, until it vanished among the stars. What had taken hours felt at once eternal and fleeting. He was left standing in the stillness, surrounded again by the hum of insects, the rustle of crops, and the familiar earth beneath his boots, and yet nothing felt the same. Antonio returned home shaken, his body aching, his mind overwhelmed. He would later say that he felt contaminated, as though something foreign lingered inside him. His skin burned in patches, his strength drained, his spirit unsettled. For days he kept the secret to himself, unsure whether to believe his own memories, unsure whether anyone else could understand. The stars above, once steady companions, now carried the weight of mystery. This night, the night of October 16th, would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. Whether truth, vision, or something beyond both, Antonio Villas Boas believed he had been taken from the earth by beings not of this world. And it was here, in this lonely field in Brazil, that one of history's first detailed accounts of alien abduction was born. When Antonio stumbled back from the fields after that long and bewildering night, his body and mind carried the weight of something he could not yet explain. The soil of the farm was still beneath his boots. The stars still shone above, but inside, everything felt changed. His skin burned, his muscles ached, and a heavy fatigue clung to him. He could not shake the sense that he had been drained, as though the very life had been drawn from his body. The silence of his home offered little comfort. The world looked the same, yet he no longer trusted its stillness. In the days that followed, his body began to rebel. He awoke with nausea that refused to pass, his appetite faltering. Headaches pulsed through him with unusual intensity. Soon, red lesions began to appear on his skin, sensitive to touch, almost as though he had been sunburned by a light harsher than the sun itself. His eyes stung, his energy weakened, and a strange heaviness settled in his chest. Antonio, a young man usually strong from labor, now found himself struggling to complete even simple tasks. At first, he kept the experience to himself. Perhaps he feared ridicule, or perhaps he needed time to sort through what had happened. But his family noticed. They saw the change in his complexion, the exhaustion in his movements. They pressed him for answers, and eventually, pieces of the truth emerged. He spoke of a strange light, of beings he could not understand, of a night that had left him wounded and bewildered. His family listened with a mix of concern and disbelief. They did not accuse him of lying, but they struggled to grasp the enormity of his words. His condition worsened, the lesions spread, his weakness deepened, and his sense of unease grew unbearable. Finally, he sought the help of a local doctor. Medical science in rural Brazil of the 1950s was limited, but Antonio's symptoms could not be ignored. The doctor who examined him noted burns and skin irritation, along with unusual fatigue and sensitivity. In later accounts, these symptoms were compared to mild radiation sickness, an illness known to affect those exposed to radioactive sources. Yet Antonio had no contact with such materials. His only explanation was the strange night aboard the glowing craft. The doctor listened carefully. Though skeptical of Antonio's story, he documented the symptoms as real, not imagined. This gave the account a peculiar credibility. Antonio was not simply telling a tale. He was suffering from measurable physical ailments. Whether caused by earthly illness or something stranger, the toll on his body was undeniable. In time, word of Antonio's experience reached beyond his family and doctor. Researchers in Brazil, including respected journalist João Martins and physician Dr. Olavo Fontes, began to investigate. They were part of a growing circle of ufologists, men who sought to catalog and understand the increasing reports of unidentified flying objects. When they heard of a young farmer claiming not just a sighting, but an abduction, their interest deepened. Antonio agreed to share his story, though he did so carefully and reluctantly. During interviews, Antonio displayed a calm steadiness. He was not excitable, nor did he embellish his account with dramatic flourishes. He spoke simply, often repeating the same details with little variation. Researchers noted that he seemed more burdened than thrilled, more weary than eager. He did not seek money or fame. Instead, he seemed to want only to be understood, and perhaps to unburden himself of the secret that had left him isolated. His confessions placed him in a difficult position. To some, he appeared delusional, a young man weaving fantasies to escape the monotony of farm life. To others, he seemed sincere, his consistency a mark of truth. His strange symptoms, his reluctance, and his seriousness created an impression that was difficult to dismiss. Whether they believed him or not, those who met Antonio often left with a sense that something extraordinary, whatever its true nature, had left its mark upon him. Psychologists who later reviewed the case considered the impact of trauma. They suggested that even if Antonio's encounter was not literal, it was real to him. The mind, they argued, can manifest powerful physical symptoms in response to stress, fear, or hallucination. But these explanations, while rational, did not diminish the mystery. If Antonio had imagined the entire event, why had his body responded with burns, nausea, and weakness? Why had his story remained so consistent, so unwavering, even decades later? The aftermath of his encounter also forced Antonio into a new role, one he had not chosen. He became, in the eyes of researchers, a case study. They probed him with questions, pressed him for details, and examined his testimony against other reports. To Antonio, This may have felt like yet another invasion, another intrusion into the privacy of his life. Yet he continued to tell his story, never retreating into denial or contradiction. Through it all, the fields remained. The crops needed tending, the soil needed turning, and the rhythms of farm life demanded his return. But for Antonio, those nightly hours in the fields would never again feel the same. Where once the stars had been silent companions, they now carried the memory of strange lights, of figures that had taken him against his will, of a night that still echoed in his body. In this quiet, painful aftermath, the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary blurred. Antonio was no longer just a farmer. He was a witness to something few could comprehend. His story would not fade, though he may have wished it would. Instead, it would grow, shared first with family, then with doctors, and finally with researchers, who saw in his words the seed of a mystery far larger than one man's life. And so the aftermath became the beginning of something bigger, the transformation of a farmer's ordeal into a cornerstone of UFO history. From confusion and illness, from confessions whispered in small rooms, the tale of Antonio Villas Boas began to take its first steps into the wider world. As Antonio's strange case slowly moved beyond his farm and into the awareness of researchers, it marked a turning point not only for him, but also for the entire study of UFO phenomena. His was not simply a sighting of strange lights in the sky, nor the discovery of curious marks on the earth. It was a claim of being taken, of having direct contact, even physical intimacy, with otherworldly beings. In the mid-1950s, such a story was nearly unheard of, making Antonio's testimony one of the earliest abduction narratives ever recorded. The researchers who became most involved in his case were Dr. Olavo Fontes, a physician and a member of the Brazilian branch of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APO, and journalist João Martins, already known in Brazil for his reporting on UFO sightings. They approached Antonio with both curiosity and caution. Martins had seen countless dubious stories pass across his desk, while Fontes, as a medical doctor, was particularly interested in Antonio's physical symptoms. What they encountered in Antonio surprised them. A young man who was quiet, consistent, and strangely detached, offering his story not with excitement or exaggeration, but with the weary steadiness of someone who seemed burdened by memory. Dr. Fontes examined Antonio's medical records and found them difficult to dismiss. The lesions, nausea, and weakness were real. While Fontes could not scientifically confirm that these symptoms were caused by alien contact, he admitted they bore similarities to mild radiation exposure. Fontes presented his findings to APRO, giving Antonio's case a place in international UFO studies. For the organization, Antonio's testimony was a revelation. Most cases until then focused on lights in the sky, radar anomalies, or unusual craft. Here was a man describing not just observation but participation, being taken into a craft, interacting with its occupants, and then returning to Earth with physical after effects. This made Antonio's story invaluable, but also volatile. To believers, it was the first concrete example of what humanity might face when they decided to interact with us directly. To skeptics, it was an outrageous claim, almost too sensational to be trusted. How could an uneducated farmer from Brazil have concocted such a tale? And if he had invented it, why would he stick to it so stubbornly, even when ridicule followed? Journalist João Martins worked to publish Antonio's account, first in Brazilian outlets and later through international UFO circles. The story soon reached American researchers, who were stunned by its content. At the time, the concept of alien abduction was not yet firmly established in the cultural imagination. Reports of flying saucers had been widespread since 1947, but most stories ended with lights vanishing or strange objects fleeing into the night. Antonio's account was different. It suggested that UFOs were not just machines to be studied from afar, but vessels carrying beings who could and would interact with us directly, even against our will. The case gained further prominence when it was included in international UFO publications in the early 1960s, just before the famous case of Betty and Barney Hill in the United States. Many researchers later noted how remarkable it was that Antonio's story predated the Hills by several years. This challenged skeptics, who argued that alien abduction stories were merely products of popular culture. In Antonio's case, there had been no cultural blueprint for such a tale. He had not been influenced by films, books, or television programs featuring alien kidnappings. His narrative appeared before the trope existed in public consciousness, making it harder to dismiss as imitation. Still, skeptics pressed their case. Some suggested Antonio suffered from psychological disturbances, perhaps hallucinations brought on by overwork, illness, or stress. Others argued that he may have fabricated the story for attention, though this seemed inconsistent with his quiet demeanor and lack of financial gain. A few critics claimed that the involvement of researchers like Martins and Fontes had shaped or even influenced Antonio's testimony. They asked, had Antonio been guided consciously or unconsciously into telling a story that fit the emerging framework of UFO interest? One particularly strong argument from skeptics was that Antonio's description of the female alien seemed too convenient, too dreamlike, shaped by human desires, rather than alien biology. The idea of forced intimacy with a seductive extraterrestrial led some to dismiss the account as a fantasy, or even a subconscious projection of suppressed emotions. Yet, as researchers pointed out, the odd details in Antonio's story, such as the strange red marks, the unfamiliar language, the odd tubes and symbols inside the craft, did not sound like the kind of inventions an uneducated farmer might easily conjure. If it were fantasy, it was one filled with peculiar disjointed fragments rather than coherent myth-making. For those in the UFO research community, Antonio's story represented a profound step forward. It expanded the scope of what UFOs might mean. No longer were they just machines flying overhead, they were now potential instruments of direct interaction. The concept of abduction, though terrifying, gave researchers a new lens through which to examine reports. Suddenly, accounts that might have been dismissed as dreams or hallucinations could be reconsidered. If Antonio's experience was true, then others could be happening across the globe, unnoticed or unspoken. This period also marked the birth of abduction research as a serious subfield within ufology. Antonio's case gave researchers a framework for questioning witnesses, looking for physical symptoms, and considering psychological trauma. His story helped inspire others to come forward, especially after the Hills case gained widespread media coverage. When the Hills underwent hypnosis and revealed their narrative of medical examination aboard a UFO, researchers drew direct comparisons to Antonio. The overlap between the two cases, despite occurring on different continents, in different cultures, years apart, seemed to suggest a pattern. At the same time, Antonio's testimony forced the UFO community to confront its own credibility issues. For some, the sexual nature of his account was too difficult to present publicly. Early UFO organizations worried that sensational elements might damage the seriousness of their research, and yet, without including those details, the story lost its most distinctive features. Researchers walked a delicate line between wanting to share Antonio's case as groundbreaking and fearing it might open them to ridicule. Despite these tensions, Antonio never retracted his story. Unlike many who later claimed abductions, he did not appear in search of publicity. In fact, he avoided the spotlight whenever possible. Years later, when interviewed again as a lawyer and family man, he repeated the same details without variation. His life had moved on, but the memory remained unchanged. This consistency became one of the strongest arguments for those who believed him. In the broader scope of UFO history, Antonio Villas Boas's experience became a foundation stone. Researchers viewed it as the first full abduction case on record, one that predated, and perhaps foreshadowed, all others. Skeptics continued to question its validity, but even in their doubt, they acknowledged its influence. It had introduced an entirely new narrative into the UFO mystery, one that reshaped how people thought about what these encounters might truly mean. And so, from the testimony of a single farmer in rural Brazil, the abduction narrative was born. It was fragile, controversial, and often ridiculed, yet it refused to disappear. Instead, it took root, influencing not only researchers, but also the imaginations of people across the world. Antonio's story had become more than his own. It had become a lens through which humanity began to consider the possibility that we were not merely being observed, but sometimes chosen. By the time Antonio Villas Boas's testimony had spread beyond Brazil, it was no longer just a story about one man and his strange night in the fields. It had become a cultural event. His experience entered the growing body of UFO lore and planted seeds that would blossom into one of the most persistent and haunting narratives of the modern era: alien abduction. What had begun as a lonely farmer's ordeal gradually echoed across continents, shaping how people, researchers, and entire cultures came to understand the mysterious phenomena in the skies. In Brazil itself, Antonio's story became a point of fascination, whispered in rural towns and discussed in the small but determined circles of ufologists. For a country where modernization was still unevenly spread between sprawling cities and isolated farmlands, the idea that extraterrestrials might descend upon a simple farmer carried both symbolic and unsettling weight. It suggested that contact, if real, was not reserved for scientists or governments. It could happen to anyone. In some ways, this democratization of the UFO experience made it more frightening. If a young man on a tractor could be chosen, so could a child asleep in bed, or a traveler walking home at night. Internationally, Antonio's case gained attention just as UFO culture was beginning to solidify. The 1960s ushered in an era when science fiction films, Cold War anxieties, and the first steps towards space exploration converged to create fertile ground for alien stories. Into this cultural soil, the Villas Boas narrative was planted. Researchers and writers cited it as one of the earliest accounts of alien abduction, and soon it began to appear in magazines, newsletters, and eventually in books that attempted to catalog the growing number of reports. The timing of Antonio's story was significant. In the early 1960s, the American case of Betty and Barney Hill exploded into public awareness. Under hypnosis, the Hills described being taken aboard a craft, medically examined, and shown unfamiliar star maps. Their story was widely covered, particularly in the United States, and quickly became a cultural touchstone. For many, the Hills case was the first time they had encountered the concept of alien abduction. Yet for researchers already familiar with Antonio's account, the similarities were striking. Both stories involved medical procedures, both emphasized loss of control, and both described beings who communicated in unfamiliar ways. This overlap led ufologists to consider the possibility of a global pattern. Were these cases isolated fantasies, or fragments of a larger phenomenon expressing itself in different places and cultures? The fact that Antonio's story predated the Hills case by several years made it harder for skeptics to claim that abduction narratives were simply the product of media influence. After all, Antonio had shared his story before the concept had entered mainstream Western culture. To many, this suggested that something deeper was at work, perhaps a genuine phenomenon unfolding across the globe. Popular culture quickly absorbed the themes of abduction, though often in distorted or dramatized ways. Films and television shows of the late 1960s and 1970s began to depict humans being taken by strange beings, examined or experimented on. While Hollywood added layers of terror or spectacle, the core ideas bore resemblance to what Antonio had described: beams of light, loss of bodily autonomy, and the mysterious intentions of non-human visitors. Over time, these images became ingrained in the public imagination, creating a feedback loop where real accounts influenced art, and art in turn shaped how new witnesses understood their own experiences. For the UFO research community, Antonio's case became a benchmark. Investigators began to look for consistencies across reports: the paralysis of abductees, the strange marks left on their bodies, the medical-like procedures, and the sense of being studied as though humanity were a subject in a vast experiment. Patterns emerged not only in Brazil and the United States, but also in Europe, Africa, and Asia. People from different cultural backgrounds, often with no exposure to each other's stories, described experiences that bore uncanny similarities. Sociologists and psychologists examined this growing wave with both skepticism and fascination. Some argued that the cultural spread of abduction stories reflected the anxieties of the modern world, fear of technology, the trauma of medicalization, and the looming threat of nuclear war. Others suggested that abduction accounts might represent a new kind of folklore, a modern mythology for an era where the mysteries of the cosmos replaced the mysteries of forests and seas. In this view, Antonio Villas Boas was less an individual victim and more the unwitting author of a story that humanity seemed ready to tell. Yet, Antonio's account retained a unique weight precisely because of its early date and its raw, unsettling details. The female alien he described, the odd mixture of desire and coercion, the physical after-effects, all of these made his testimony stand out even as abduction narratives multiplied. Later stories might focus more on medical experimentation or interstellar messages, but Antonio's remained visceral, grounded in the body and in the soil of his farmland. Researchers often cited it as proof that the abduction phenomenon was not merely a cultural fad of the 1960s and beyond, but something that had surfaced before the world was primed to expect it. As abduction reports spread, Antonio's story also began to influence how abductees framed their own experiences. Some described feelings of being part of breeding programs or experiments, echoing the reproductive undertones of his encounter. Others spoke of lights, burns, or mysterious illnesses afterward, recalling the symptoms Antonio had struggled with. In subtle but significant ways, his testimony became a reference point, shaping not only how researchers categorized cases, but also how experiencers understood themselves. The cultural ripples extended even further, inspiring artists, novelists, and filmmakers to explore themes of abduction and alien contact. In Brazil, Antonio's story became part of local UFO lore, a reminder that the phenomenon was not confined to North America or Europe. In global UFO studies, it became a cornerstone case, cited alongside the Hills, the Pascagoula incident, and later events like the Travis Walton abduction. Though still controversial, it could not be ignored. What began in the lonely darkness of a Brazilian field thus transformed into a global narrative. Antonio Villas Boas may never have intended his story to reach beyond his family or his doctor, yet it became one of the most influential testimonies in UFO history. His account, once dismissed as an outlandish tale, helped give form to a mystery that would grow into a worldwide pattern of fear, fascination, and cultural expression. The ripples of his story continue to this day. In every account of alien abduction, whether whispered in therapy sessions, published in research journals, or dramatized on television, there is an echo of Antonio's night in 1957. His ordeal, with all its strangeness and ambiguity, opened a door, and once opened, that door could never fully be closed. As the decades passed, and the UFO phenomenon evolved, Antonio Villas Boas's case remained a persistent point of discussion. What once seemed an isolated tale, told by a young farmer in rural Brazil, gradually took on the status of a historical cornerstone, often revisited as researchers, scientists, and skeptics tried to make sense of alien abduction reports. With time, fresh perspectives emerged, some supportive, some dismissive, but nearly all acknowledging that Antonio's testimony could not be easily ignored. By the 1970s and 1980s, when abduction cases were gaining wider visibility in the United States and Europe, Antonio's account was frequently revisited as a precedent. Researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who studied hundreds of abductees, often compared later reports to the Brazilian case. They noted both striking similarities and key differences. Antonio described being physically handled and examined, even subjected to intimate contact, while later abductees often spoke of surgical procedures, hybridization themes, or psychological manipulation. Still, the core elements, removal from ordinary life, strange medical-like processes, and physical after-effects, were consistent. This suggested to believers that Antonio's account was not a fantasy, but an early glimpse of a continuing phenomenon. Medical and scientific voices entered the conversation as well. Some physicians studied Antonio's reported symptoms, especially the burns and lesions, and considered them consistent with ultraviolet or radiation exposure. Others argued the evidence was far too weak, relying heavily on second-hand documentation rather than direct laboratory testing. Without preserved samples or hospital records available for verification, skeptics argued the medical aspect of his case rested more on anecdote than data. Still, the fact that a doctor at the time had taken his symptoms seriously gave the account more weight than most UFO stories of that era. Psychologists offered a different lens. For them, the case raised questions about human perception, trauma, and memory. Some argued that Antonio may have experienced a waking dream or sleep paralysis episode, amplified by stress and cultural context. They pointed out that altered states of consciousness can produce vivid hallucinations that feel real, sometimes accompanied by physical symptoms like rashes or weakness triggered by stress hormones. Others suggested that Antonio's account fit within the framework of archetypal imagery, with the alien beings representing unconscious fears or desires. Jungian analysts, for example, saw alien abduction stories as modern myths, psychological events expressed in symbolic language. Yet, Antonio's unwavering consistency complicated these psychological explanations. He never wavered, never embellished, and never sought fame or money. Decades later, when interviewed as a lawyer and family man, he told the same story in the same calm, measured tone. Skeptics found this difficult to dismiss. If the encounter were hallucination or fantasy, why did he cling to it so firmly, even when ridicule might have been easier? His persistence, paradoxically, gave both believers and skeptics something to wrestle with. In modern UFO studies, Antonio's case is often categorized as high strangeness, a term used to describe events that include elements so bizarre they resist easy explanation. Unlike sightings of strange lights, which might be dismissed as aircraft or natural phenomena, Antonio's encounter involved detailed narrative, physical interaction, and physiological effects. Such cases are more difficult to debunk without reducing the witness's testimony to invention or delusion. For researchers open to the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, Antonio's case is often presented as one of the earliest and strongest examples of abduction. At the same time, his account has been examined through the lens of cultural anthropology. Scholars note how his story reflects themes of powerlessness, technological intrusion, and even colonial anxiety. In 1950s Brazil, many rural communities felt dominated by distant powers, urban elites, foreign corporations, and modern technology, reshaping their world. Some anthropologists argue that Antonio's abduction mirrored these cultural tensions. A farmer seized by advanced beings, studied, and then returned, powerless and changed. From this perspective, the story may reveal as much about mid-20th century Brazilian society as about extraterrestrials. Modern skeptics continue to argue that Antonio's story was shaped or even constructed with the help of researchers eager for evidence. They point out that by the time his story was widely shared, UFO investigators like APRO were already seeking strong abduction cases to validate their theories. Could Antonio have been guided, consciously or unconsciously, to tell a story that fit the expectations of these investigators? Some critics believe so, yet defenders of Antonio argue that his initial reluctance, his private suffering, and the medical evidence suggest otherwise. If this were an invention, it was a costly one, bringing him illness, scrutiny, and a lifetime of association with something he never seemed to enjoy revisiting. Today, Antonio's encounter is studied alongside other foundational cases such as the Hill abduction, the Pascagoula incident, and the Travis Walton case. In every conference, book or documentary on alien abduction, his name surfaces. Some view him as the first known abductee, the man who unknowingly introduced humanity to a frightening reality. Others see him as the victim of cultural suggestion or psychological disturbance, his story transformed by ufologists into a myth that shaped decades of belief. What is perhaps most striking about modern perspectives is the way Antonio's case continues to straddle the line between credibility and impossibility. For believers, it represents groundbreaking testimony that fits into a global pattern. For skeptics, it remains an unsolved psychological puzzle. For historians and cultural scholars, it is a myth in the making, one that influenced how generations imagined extraterrestrial contact. Regardless of which perspective one takes, the case has endured. Antonio's night in 1957 has outlasted countless UFO fads and conspiracy theories. It has been examined by doctors, psychologists, journalists, and anthropologists. It has been ridiculed, respected, and retold in dozens of languages, and still, more than half a century later, it remains unresolved. In this way, Antonio Villas Boas stands as both witness and symbol. His story is not only about what may have happened in a quiet Brazilian field, but also about how humanity confronts the unknown, whether by science, skepticism, or myth-making. His case bridges medicine and folklore, psychology and ufology, skepticism and belief. Modern investigations have not solved it, but they have ensured it will never be forgotten. The story of Antonio Villas Boas did not end on that October night in 1957, nor in the fevered weeks of illness that followed. It lived on, carried through decades of retelling, debate, and reinterpretation, until it became one of the most enduring cases in the history of UFO research. For Antonio himself, however, life returned to something resembling normalcy. He eventually completed his law degree, built a career, married, and raised a family. In public, he was a lawyer. In private, he was a man marked forever by an experience he neither sought nor fully understood. That contrast, the ordinary life lived alongside an extraordinary memory, became part of the quiet legacy of his case. When interviewed later in life, Antonio displayed the same calm steadiness he had shown as a young man. He did not embellish or sensationalize his account, nor did he retract it, despite having had ample opportunity to do so. He spoke with restraint, repeating the same details he had always given, as though the event were a heavy stone he had learned to carry without complaint. This consistency gave his testimony a quality rare in extraordinary claims, a sense of sincerity that even hardened skeptics acknowledged. To listen to Antonio was to hear not a man spinning a tale for attention, but one recalling something that continued to weigh on him. Among ufologists, Antonio's legacy is immense. He is often referred to as the first abductee in modern UFO history, a title that carries both honor and burden. His account set a precedent for countless abduction narratives that followed, from the hills in the United States to the Pascagoula fishermen in Mississippi and beyond. Each new case was measured, in part, against Antonio's testimony. His story provided a template: the strange lights, the loss of control, the medical-like procedures, the physical after effects, and the lingering trauma. Whether his experience was real or imagined, it undeniably shaped how people described their own encounters in the decades that followed. For skeptics, Antonio's story became a case study in the creation of modern myth. They pointed out how his tale reflected anxieties of his time, fears of technology, concerns about radiation, and the unsettling power of medical authority. They argued that Antonio's abduction could be understood as a symbolic narrative, a dreamlike expression of deeper cultural and psychological currents. To them, his legacy was not proof of alien visitors, but proof of the human mind's ability to generate profound myths when confronted with uncertainty and change. Yet even skeptics often admitted a grudging respect for Antonio himself. Unlike others who came after him, he never sought book deals, television appearances, or financial gain. He remained rooted in his community, building a life far removed from the spotlight. That grounded quality set him apart from many later abductees, making it harder to dismiss him as an opportunist. Whether one believed his story or not, his sincerity demanded a measure of respect. Culturally, Antonio's legacy spread far beyond the UFO community. His account helped shape the imagery of alien abduction that soon permeated films, novels, and television. The idea of humans being taken against their will, examined, and returned transformed, became one of the defining motifs of modern science fiction. Countless works of popular culture, from serious dramas to pulpy thrillers, echoed the themes first articulated in Antonio's testimony. Even when not mentioned by name, his story lingered in the background of the cultural imagination, a silent ancestor of the narratives that followed. In Brazil, Antonio became something of a folk figure. His story was retold in UFO journals, in popular media, and in conversations that blurred the line between legend and history. For a nation balancing rapid modernization with deep rural traditions, Antonio's experience symbolized the meeting of two worlds. The timeless rhythms of farm life, interrupted by the incomprehensible intrusion of advanced alien forces. His abduction became part of Brazil's contribution to the global UFO mystery, a reminder that the phenomenon was not confined to the skies of North America or Europe. The enduring mystery of Antonio's case lies not only in what he reported, but in what it represents. If his account is true, it suggests that contact between humans and extraterrestrials may have begun long before society was ready to confront it. If it is not true, it still holds immense significance as the spark that ignited a new kind of story, one that has since been told by thousands of others. Either way, Antonio's experience stands as a threshold moment, the point where the UFO phenomenon crossed from distant observation into direct human-centered encounter. For those who study abduction reports today, Antonio's testimony remains a touchstone. His story challenges researchers to consider the possibility that something extraordinary may have occurred in rural Brazil, long before abduction narratives were part of public culture. It challenges skeptics to explain not only his consistency, but also the way his account foreshadowed later reports across the globe. It challenges all of us, believer or skeptic, to reckon with the power of mystery, the way a single story can ripple outward, shaping culture, belief and imagination for generations. In reflecting on Antonio's legacy, one is reminded of how fragile the boundary is between the ordinary and the extraordinary. For Antonio, a simple night in the fields became a lifelong burden and an unasked-for role in history. For the rest of us, his story remains an open question, unresolved, unsettling, and strangely enduring. Decades later, we are still drawn to it, still debating, still wondering. That persistence may be the truest mark of its significance. Antonio Villas Boas passed away in 1991, having lived most of his life far from the glare of UFO fame. Yet his story endures, not because he sought to make it famous, but because it carried within it the elements of mystery that humanity cannot let go of: light in the sky, beings we cannot understand, and the profound feeling that we are not alone. Whether his account was an extraordinary truth or an extraordinary creation, it remains one of the most important and influential UFO encounters ever recorded. His legacy, then, is twofold. To believers, he is the first known abductee, a witness to an unsettling reality that continues to haunt humanity. To skeptics, he is a symbol of how myth and memory intertwine, creating stories that reveal as much about us as about the unknown. And to history, he is a reminder that mystery endures, that unanswered questions can shape cultures just as powerfully as answers. The fields where Antonio once worked are long silent, the tractor rusted, the soil turned by other hands. But in the stillness of the night sky above them, his story lingers. Each retelling keeps alive the possibility that what happened there was more than one man's dream, that it was perhaps a glimpse into a wider, stranger universe. And even if it was not, it remains a mystery that will never quite fade, echoing softly as we drift into sleep, reminding us that some stories are too strange, too deep, and too human to ever be forgotten.